on the campus at Patrick Henry College. Tonight's interviewee is Mr. George Yancey, the author of Hostile Environment: Understanding and Responding to Anti-Christian Bias. His book chronicles the lessons he's learned dealing with racial issues as they concern anti-Christian bias. He writes for Patheos, the premier online outlet to engage in the global dialogue about religion and spirituality. He is currently working to establish the first research-based Center for Christian Studies at a non-sectarian educational institution. Welcome, Mr. George Yancey.
So let's just review a little bit of your academic background. 11 books you've written? Maybe 12?
I think 14.
14, who's counting? And a PhD from the University of Texas at
Go
Austin.
Horns.
Go Longhorns, yeah, although, you know, go
They didn't
a
go,
lot.
they didn't go too well against North
Not well,
Dame.
not
No,
well
they
so
did
far.
not.
But it's a long time to go. North Texas University is where you now teach, and
Yes.
North Texas is not doing well in football either, right?
I don't know if he played yet.
Okay,
We didn't do well last year, so
there's still hope.
yeah.
Okay, and you're married, you have one child,
Yes.
and living in Denton, Texas, and I read that you once dressed up as Wolverine for Halloween.
Yeah,
This is
that was
true?
a couple of years ago. My
Okay.
wife dressed up as Storm.
Okay, okay. And
Those of you who are comic book fans know who that is, right?
yeah, and you're a superhero fan like Batman and Spider-Man and
Yes.
so forth. Do you ever dressed up as one of them? Or?
I once, when at Texas, they in order to make money, I was active with the Baptist group, and to make money, some organization hired a couple of us to dress up as Batman, and I got volunteered to do it. And so we were dressed up as Batman, passing out this literature for their comic book store, and we got money for our thing. So it was a very hot costume. I don't know how he does it.
Right, right. Well, he lives in Gotham, not Austin.
Oh, that's cooler. Yes.
Yeah, so that's the secret. You have a blog called Black, White, and Gray.
Yeah.
Right? Why that title?
Well, that didn't come from me. I joined a lot of other Christian social scientists, and they actually had already established it and were doing on a rotation, and they allowed me to come in. And now I appear to be doing most of the blogging on that. I would probably change the title. I don't know what to, so don't ask me.
Okay.
But it's not my blog. It's really one I share with other Christian social scientists. It's just that I happen to do most of the blogging on it right now.
And what do you mostly blog about?
Well, I blog about my research. I blog a lot about Christianophobia, as you know, that gears up the juices quite a bit.
Right.
But I'm also, as I publish or come to completion of certain articles, I blog a little bit of it so that people could see what the results are and what the implications are. But I also take on some of the issues of the day from time to time as they come up and as I feel the urge to. It's really an opportunity to talk to people without having to use academese, but still bring in academic research.
Okay. Now, in your work in sociology for a long time, you really looked hard and specialized in looking at racial bias questions.
Yeah.
And what types of things did you find out there that, you know, I'm going to ask you, what can you say while standing on one foot, or you know, in a few seconds? But what were the key things you found out there? And then let's compare that with what you're finding out as far as religious bias.
Well, even though, you know, I'm obviously an African American and I'm looking at race, and I do have, I mean, being black has helped to shape my perspective on racial issues. I experience race in a way that you don't and whites don't. But even though that is true, and I know I disagree with a lot of white conservatives on racial issues, I still came out as a Christian. And that did, I think, change the way I looked at race. I looked at racial conflict as how can we communicate with each other? How can we get along with each other? How can we figure out solutions that not one side wins it all or one side loses it all? Some of what I see out there in race scholarship today, well, actually a lot of what I see out there is not about that. It's about documenting grievances and promoting solutions, but they're not about dialogue. I guess a really good example is the whole Black Lives Matter movement.
Okay.
And I get the issue. I mean, the evidence is out there about criminal justice system and African-American males. I mean, that's a real issue. But the tone is totally wrong. If you want to have an engagement where we can find solutions that everyone can live with, then we have to have a better tone than what this movement has done. And so I want these issues addressed, but I want them addressed in a way that can find solutions. And I don't think everyone who does race ethnicity really wants solutions. They want the issue. And that may be one of the reasons why I don't really want to study race as much anymore, because I don't feel the people who are doing it really want to find solutions as much as they want the issue. And I'm about solutions. Okay,
let me just ask about the Black Lives Matter slogan. I mean, I can see historically why that would make a lot of sense as a slogan. Just in studying journalism history, the stories about in New York from, say, half a century ago, where there were a lot of killings that were going on. Cub reporter comes in all excited, there's been a killing on this particular subway line. The editor says, okay, so where exactly was that? Well, it's a line going up to Harlem. And the editor says, that's not important. Yeah. Basically, black lives in that sense didn't matter.
Right.
But it's often taken, or it seems that way to white folks, as saying, well, black lives matter especially,
right,
and white lives really don't matter, or cop lives don't matter at present. So how do you do that, given the tensions involved there? How do you navigate that in a way so that we can get along?
Well, you've been married for umpteen years.
I'm for 39.
39 years, okay. Yeah. And you know what the key part of your marriage is communication.
It's basically saying I'm wrong. So,
yeah, you have to communicate that well.
Susan's giving me a face there. No,
so you got to go home. So you better be careful. So my wife is in here, so I can say stuff like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Although this is taped, so I might get in trouble later on.
That's right.
But communication is incredibly important. So if you're trying to say something to Susan and she's not getting it, then you have to change the way you deliver your message, because obviously she's not getting the way you're saying it. And so what I've said to some of the people who defend Black Lives Matter is, why not add Black Lives Matter 2?
Okay.
Just add 3 little letters. And then you don't have to then explain to people, well, we're not saying all lives don't matter. We're just saying that Black lives have been neglected. And yet when I suggest this, there's a big backlash against that. And that's part of what makes me think that this is not about finding a solution all can live with. It's more about imposing a solution. And that's not going to work in race relations. We can only impose so much on people before they start fighting back. I've always been about finding solutions. And the solutions are not going to be what the typical white conservative wants it to be. But it's neither is going to be what the stereotypical black radical wants it to be. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. But until we can communicate with each other, we can't find those solutions. So add 2 to it. Black Lives Matter 2. And then I think whites can hear that. But yeah, I get what you're saying, that whites hear Black Lives Matter, I think Black Lives Matter only.
Yeah, that's the way it's heard. Okay, I usually try to be a minimalist interviewer, but insofar as you brought up the whole question of husband-wife communication, I do have to tell one story that I think will be really useful to all you young folks here. Okay, this goes back to 1988, when Susan and I had been married only 12 years. We are on a trip, we are walking through the streets of Paris. And Susan is getting thirsty. It's hot. Susan is a wonderful traveler, but she's getting a little thirsty. And so we've been walking along for a couple hours or so, and Susan asks me, "Are you thirsty?" And I say, "Well, no, I'm not thirsty." And then we walk along some more. And I did not realize that Susan, when she asks, "Are you thirsty?" was actually saying, wife's thirst matters. Not quite why lives matter, but wife's thirst matters. I didn't get it. And finally, I realized the language involved here. But it took me a long time. We've been married for 12 years, and I still didn't recognize that. Is that an accurate story, or is there other parts of it?
Finally realized that I was really thirsty.
Well, when you finally said, as I recall, in your kind and gentle way, "Let's sit down at a cafe," or something like that. So anyway, but I realized, anyway, it's just an aside. Now we go back to the interview. You tell once a story about you're sitting in a classroom and a professor talks in a very derogatory way about Bible thumpers. And if he had said, let's say in relation to Muslims or Arabs, if he had said raghead, that obviously would have been a case of intolerance.
Yeah.
But he could say Bible thumper in this derogatory way, and no one looked amiss at that.
Yeah.
So that's when, I mean, in the same way that the light finally went on after being married for 12 years, that I had to learn how to really listen and be loving and altruistic rather than selfish. Is that when the light went on for you, that there's actually more religious bias in some ways at present in America? Unlike in the old, the former days, now there's more religious bias than racial bias?
Well, I don't know if that was the moment, but it was one of the moments where when this professor, when she said Bible thumpers, and no one stirred, and no one said anything afterwards. Whereas obviously if she said raghead, probably someone would have went to the dean about it. That was one of the moments where I began to perceive that in academia, and at the time, this was late 1980s, maybe early 1990s, and so there still was a lot of racial animosity, still is today, obviously. But in academia, the animosity was not racially based. The animosity was based on whether you're a Christian or not. And I can say that in academia, I face more prejudice for being a Christian than for being black. Now, I won't say that for my whole life because things have happened to me as an African American, but those things have happened to me outside of academia. In academia, it's really about, as far as intolerance, I've faced more intolerance as a Christian than as an African American. It's not even close.
What's an example of that intolerance that you faced?
Well, and this is a story I give as well, just to illustrate the differences. When I was an adjunct, I had 4 classes one of my semesters, and I had 2 intros, a sociology, religion, and a race ethnicity course. And I had someone come up to me and says, well, there was talk about not giving the religion course, and I said, why? I said, well, they were worried because you're a Christian and you would be biased. Now, I'm black. I am biased when I teach race ethnicity. I try to, and in my religion course, I try to present even-handedly both sides, but we're all biased. It doesn't occur to people to think, academics to think that an African American is going to be biased teaching a race ethnicity course. It occurs to them to think that a Christian is going to be biased teaching a religion course. So those are the sort of things that, it's not that people are saying, I'm not going to hire you because you're a Christian. It's not anything overt like that. But those are sort of the ways in which you create an uncomfortable atmosphere for Christians in higher education. The sort of cues you're given that, you may not quite belong here because of your faith. And of course, you tell people who are not Christians that, they go, oh, you're making too much of it. But what if it had been the other way around? What if someone had said, well, we're not sure that you should teach this race ethnicity course because you're black, and then go to people who care about civil rights for African Americans and give them that example and see what they have to say about that. And then all of a sudden, this is not such a small deal, especially when it happens multiple times.
Yeah. So you write in your book, and by the way, this is the book, and it's really it's a good book. Really, it's Hostile Environment, Understanding and Responding to Anti-Christian Bias. So, a real, in fact, here, back here a quotation: "The only good Christian is a dead Christian." Actually, in many ways, the best Christian ever is a dead Christian who was then resurrected. But moving along.
I don't think that's what they meant, though.
No, I don't think so. There's what are some of the comments? I mean, besides this, the only good Christian is a dead Christian. What are some of the other comments that you've heard?
Well, these comments came from what we did is we did an open-ended questionnaire, so people can write with it what they want. So we didn't actually hear the comments; we read the comments. So people wrote. This is what people wrote. And one of the books the research that this book's based out of, the title of the book is "So Many Christians, So Few Lions."
Right.
And you can actually buy a T-shirt that says "So Many Christians, So Few Lions." And the place you can buy a T-shirt that says "So Many Christians, So Few Lions" will not sell you a T-shirt that has the Confederate flag.
Okay.
So, it's all right to have a T-shirt talking about torturing Christians, but the Confederate flag, which I'm not a fan of, obviously, we can't have.
And they wouldn't have a T-shirt saying, so many African Americans, so few Ku Klux Klan members.
Yeah, or so many Jews, so few ovens.
Right.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And so that comment was made by several of my respondents. There's other comments such as, I wish I could nuke all churches or give Christians a lobotomy, and there's about 3,000 people who filled out these questionnaires, so you can say there's only a few comments, but there's enough that there was a sense there, and then when you tie it into the other themes that the other people were making, you can see the sort of level of animosity that certain people have towards Christians.
Yeah. Now, I used to write, this is going back a dozen years or so, I would write about Christophobia in terms of fear of Christ.
Yeah.
Now, you use the term Christianophobia.
Yeah.
So is there a difference, and which do you think there's more of? Is it fear of Christ or fear of Christians?
Yeah. I think that the person who has this sort of phobia, they may not like the philosophy of Christianity, but I think the thing that they have hostility towards is probably more Christians themselves and people actually living out that philosophy. So that's probably why I would head towards Christianophobia. But if someone wants to use Christophobia, we really struggle with the best term. We thought, should we say anti-Christian, sort of like an anti-Semitic, anti-Christian. That didn't quite fit. We just felt that was not the best fit. So I'm not completely comfortable with the term Christianophobia. I wish someone magically could come up with a term that I would go, oh, that's it. It's magic. But that's the best term we have at this point.
So what do you think is the cause? Or let me put it another way. How much of Christianophobia is due to the action of Christians? Mm-hmm. And how much is just basic hatred regardless of how Christians act?
Yeah. I think whenever there's a group that's hated, you're going to always find people in that group who act in ways that are disrespectful. You're going to find Christians who are hypocrites. You're going to find Christians who treat people badly. You're going to find that. And so to the degree you find that, and that has influenced some of the people who are in my sample, you could say that Christians have helped to create some of this. But that doesn't excuse prejudice, bigotry. Right. We can find bad apples everywhere. But to judge people on the few bad apples is wrong. And so when my respondents talk about how Christians cannot critically think, or how Christians are intolerant, or how Christians are white, which is kind of funny because my respondents were overwhelmingly white, or how Christians are insane, or want a theocracy, or these sort of stereotypes are out there. That's not acceptable. We shouldn't stereotype groups like that. Mm-hmm. And so I do say that yes, there are Christians who do some of those things, but we would not do that with other groups. So why do we accept it for Christians?
Yeah. So let me bring it home to the students here at Patrick Henry College. This is what you have to face. This is a great college. I'm glad you're here. I suspect you all are glad you're here. But you are going to face prejudice. Anyone who looks at this and knows anything about Patrick Henry or Patrick Henry College is going to be biased against you. What can they do? What should they do? What can you suggest for them?
Well, I think that as an individual Christian, obviously we try to live up to the standards that's been set for us. We're called to try to love those, even those who don't love us back, and that's the initial aspect. As far as changing as a body, I think that we've seen, especially in this past year, that our society, I think, has undergone changes that are going to be with us for the foreseeable future. I think that we really have to pay attention to culture. Politics is good, but we also have to do culture. We're going to have to look at how we can influence the culture. The notion that there's a moral majority that's going to have this controlled culture is just, if it was ever true, it's not true now. But we have a right to have an influence in the culture. One of the things that people with Christianophobia want to do is to exclude Christians from the public square. They don't, and many of them say this, they don't think Christians should have a voice in politics.
They don't think Christians should be professors.
Some of them don't feel that way.
Yeah.
But we have to fight for our voice in the public square. Not that we have to dominate the public square, but we have the right to have a voice in the public square. And I just did a blog recently where I pointed out Christianophobia is not fair, because at the heart of Christianophobia is this belief that Christians should not have a voice in the public square. We would not say that about any other group. We would not say that to feminists. We would not say to feminists, keep your feminism in your homes, in your organizations, but don't take it in the public square. We would not say that about Marxists. We would not say that about LGBT people. Keep it in your homes and your organizations. But people say that about Christians. Keep your Christianity in your homes and your churches and nowhere else. That is not American, and we have the right to fight for that. And I think that we should fight for that. Fighting to take over the public square, I worry about the way some Christians approach it and the goals of that. But fighting to keep our voice in the public square so that we can live out our lives in the public square like everyone else gets an opportunity to, there's nothing wrong with that.
So how did you come at the recent situation? Well, it's not just recent, it's ongoing, involving the Kentucky County Clerk, Kim Davis. How do you assess that and the actions that she took, the actions that the judge took? Tell us about your take on that.
It's funny because I just posted on Facebook about that today and got a lot of comments. When I post stuff on Facebook, sometimes I get people from both sides of the aisle mad at me because I don't fit. So I had 3 major points. My first point is I don't see what she's doing as part of religious freedom because she is a government official. This is, to me, is not the same situation as a Christian baker or florist, where people are trying to force them to do something in their own private business. So I think she's wrong. I think she should resign if she really feels this way. And there's no accommodation to be made because she is, it's the render to Caesar sort of mentality. But my second point is, why is she put in jail? Because there are other public officials who do not follow their duties, officials who were marrying same-sex partners before it was legal. I think an official in Washington, D.C., I forget who, was not given gun licenses. They're not put in jail. So, and one of the things in my book I talk about is Christians should not talk about being persecuted here in the United States because we're not, if we look at Christians around the world.
We're harassed.
We're harassed, we're not persecuted. There's a big difference. Yeah. But putting someone in jail, now you sort of feed into that mentality. And then my third point was that, I hear some progressives talk about rule of law, and I just can't take them seriously because they did not seem to be concerned with rule of law when it came to, Gavin Newsom, the San Francisco mayor, who had same-sex marriages before they were legal, and this D.C. official in other situations. And so, if you're just going to say, look, this is a good talking point, then you really don't believe in the rule of law. And if you didn't speak up about it before, then I have no interest in you speaking up about it now. And I would say the same thing about conservatives. I mean, if you were speaking up about the rule of law with that, then you should be speaking up with the rule of law now. Principles are principles no matter whether they work for you or against you, or else they're not your principles. So that's sort of my take on this particular situation.
Let me just ask a couple of questions about that. As I understand it, what Kim Davis was wanting, and I guess what she's still wanting, is to take her name off the license.
Yeah.
And if they take her name off the license, then go ahead and do that. We have, ever since the civil rights legislation, an amendment in 1972, we have this principle of trying to have accommodations whenever possible.
Yeah.
If you can't do it, then you can't. But if there's something easy to do, then let's, to quote Rodney King, can't we all get along?
Right.
So wasn't that a simple thing to be able to do?
Yeah. I'm under no illusion that there aren't people there who don't want to get along. But in the end of the day, she has a job she has to do, and if she's unable to do the job, they won't accommodate her. And we're talking about a government job, not a private business. I think that's a different thing when you're talking about a private business and you're trying to go in and force them to do something else. Then I think you are talking about religious freedom issues there much more deeply. But here's the analogy I would use. If you are a Christian pacifist and you want to join the army eventually tells you got to go kill someone, well, either you remain in the army and you do what you're supposed to do, or you resign. I know in the army it's not quite that easy. I mean, there's AWOL, and all, but I mean the illustration is there. The government has a certain job. If you can't do it, then you can't stay in that job, and that's where I would come down on that. I mean, if they can accommodate her, it's great, but they can't, then she has to make that sort of decision.
And what happens then if there are Christian officials who feel strongly about this, and they could be accommodated, but for whatever reason they're not being accommodated, doesn't that just, and they resign, doesn't that force Christians out of the public square, which is what you don't want to see happen?
Well, in the governmental situation, I think that there's a different dynamic. I do think that, you know, if those officials want to sue to get the accommodations, then by all means let them sue. But if ultimately the courts decide that it's not there, then I think I'm not as scared if something like this happens, because there's other ways around we can get into the public square.
Okay.
And you know, we can put pressures on people. If Kentucky is not going to accommodate her, who are the government officials who are not accommodating her, and let's vote them out of office. I mean, we do have some recourses that we could do, and we can making it an issue is fine. I'm uncomfortable with her not fulfilling her duties as she was supposed to do. And I understand where she's coming from, but I think the honorable thing to have been, after she sued and lost, would have been to resign. To me, that would have been the honorable thing to have done. That still does not excuse the throwing in jail. The throwing in jail was too far.
Okay. Let me ask a couple other things here. And you have from one of your research analyses here, you say that half of all academics are less willing to hire a candidate for an academic job if they learn the person is a conservative Protestant.
Yes.
So that's well documented at this point.
Well, that's in my book, and there's other research that if it doesn't have that percentages, I'm at the point now where I say that Christian bias against anti-Christian bias in academia is established academically. There's not much. There's a couple of studies that suggest it may not be, but even those studies tend to focus in on more political bias than religious bias. When it comes to religious bias, it's very well documented that that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's documented, and you know, you've seen it personally. I saw it personally at the University of Texas, so it's clearly there.
Well, it's not just the personal. You know, I'm always careful about it, because anecdotes can you know, but systematically. That's why my research was systematic, and there's other research that's systematic. So it's not that this particular person did not like me because I was a Christian. This is a problem of academia in general. That they would see a Christian, and then simply because they're a conservative Protestant, they'd be less likely to hire them.
So the students here have some recourse. Let's say there's a student here with good grades, good GREs, applies to a graduate program, doesn't get accepted, finds that students with worse GREs and not as good GPAs is accepted. We have a whole set of ways now to deal with racial bias.
Yeah.
What are the opportunities, or are there, to deal with religious bias if they personally encounter it?
Well, right now, to be honest, there's not a lot of legal opportunities, because while religion is recognized as a protected class, Christians are not thought of as a group needing protection in academia, even though, as I said, I face more stuff as a Christian than I did as an African American. So I'm not a lawyer. That's why I think we have to work on the culture so that we can gain a perspective that in this area, yes, Christians are at a disadvantage. This is not something that's just people have made up. This has been documented. And so since it's been documented, there should be some sort of legal remedies if you can show that your file was as good as the person they let in, and that it was likely that religion was what kept you out. But legally, I don't know if you can do that right now.
Okay, well, let's talk about the culture. How do you work in the culture? I mean, we've clearly seen the importance over the past 15 years of the changing depiction of gays on television in lots of areas, Will and Grace and lots of other programs, and that's had an enormous impact. But there you have people in Hollywood and elsewhere who really want to change the image, and they're very deliberate about it, and the Human Rights Campaign and others have a very concerted way to do that, but they have lots of allies there.
Yeah.
What as Christians? I mean, if we want to, in a sense, learn from the success of the LGBT movement in changing attitudes, and you have all this prejudice against Christians now, but the culture makers, for the most part, are part of the problem rather than part of the potential solution,
Yeah.
what do you do?
Well, it's going to be a long-term solution. I mean, if we think that, hey, let's elect Ted Cruz and that's going to solve that, we're sadly mistaken.
We want to elect Donald Trump, of course. He's going to take everything.
Well, yes.
Yeah. So
Go Trump.
go Trump. So,
But what happened over time, if you look at that did not happen overnight. That happened over a long period of time. And so what's going to happen for Christians is a long period of time. Christians are going to have to go into Hollywood, go into the media, go into academia, and not with the idea that we're going to go in and we're going to create all this pro-Christian literature and we're going to force it on people, but at first just to go in so that when they do the next movie and they want to portray the Christian as the intolerant bigot, and they realize, oh no, my producer is a Christian, and that wouldn't be nice, and so maybe they change that a little bit. When you go in academia, and you're a Christian, and you can look at anti-Christian bias because you see it more easily than someone who's not a Christian who can just blow it off because it doesn't affect them. When you go into the media and the story comes across of a church shooting, and perhaps you can suggest that maybe we shouldn't focus just in on the gun, but this may be a hate crime, just as we would see that as a hate crime if it was an Islamic temple, because you're a Christian in that way. So I think the initial influence will be just contact. And then over time, as more Christians are there, then we would have more of an impact that would be larger and stronger. But what's happened is that a lot of Christians have shied away from getting into academia, media, or if they do it in a Christian setting, a Christian college, a Christian media, that sort of thing, which has a very important purpose. But if that's all we do, there's a lot of people that'll never pick up World Magazine, or they'll never even step a foot on this campus. But they'll read Newsweek, or they'll step a foot on University of North Texas campus, and they could be influenced in that way. And so we're going to have to make a concerted effort. I like the idea of a calling. If you're called, I think you all should consider: are you called to doing something like this? Are you called to going into a secular environment, cultural, creative environment? Academia, media, entertainment, those sort of things. If you're not, then you're not. But if you are, then there's a challenge to that. And we could talk about how you try to deal with those challenges as well. But that is part of what Christians are going to have to start doing if we're going to start changing the culture.
Yeah, I'm going to tell one other story here for you all. I mean, if you're thinking of graduate school and you're thinking, oh no, I'm going to face prejudice and things like that, you may very well. But I would still, if you feel called to that, I'd really go for it. And here's the story about one of your professors here, Professor Sillars. Les Sillars had a Bible college degree from Canada. He had worked on a conservative Christian newspaper there. When he applied for the PhD program in journalism at the University of Texas, I at that time was on the graduate studies committee, the program that said yes or no to people. And the bias of the professors against Les Sillars was very strong. I mean, he had excellent GRE scores. He had good professional experience, but it's at this Christian newspaper. He had good GPA, but it's at this Bible college, and there was a real move not to have him be admitted. But he was admitted. He performed brilliantly there. Got all A's and wrote a great dissertation and so forth. And he survived, and that helped every other Christian student who applied to graduate school in journalism over the next few years. Because here's one guy who had this terrible background according to the other professors and did splendidly, and that helped others. So, if you feel called to it, if you want to do it, if you can put up with a little bit of nastiness at times, if you have a tough enough skin, or a realization that in Christ this is what we all need to do to step forward even when there's prejudice, I'd suggest go for it, and you'll be helping not only yourself, but perhaps helping others along the way. So anyway, that's just one story right here from Patrick Henry, journalism professor here at Les Sillars, graduate of UT. Still, I don't think cheers for the Longhorns as he cheers for Canadian things, but what can you do?
Can't be perfect.
Can't be perfect, exactly. Now you, You write here that racism is not the same as Christianophobia, but basically in a way you were able to apply what you learned in looking at racial bias to looking at religious bias. So what's applicable, what's not applicable? How is it similar, how is it different?
Well, I think when you talk about all sorts of intolerances, there's certain things that are similar, like the nature of prejudices and the way we have confirmation bias on our stereotypes. And I think you can say that that's true just about any sort of biases. Racism, there is a violent element to racism that by and large is missing in Christianophobia. I mean, people aren't going to hit you over the head. There's not the talk about the police harassing you as it is in race. And of course we have a history of racism, whereas Christianophobia is probably relatively new, and that history has set African Americans up in a certain way in our society. Now, here's the thing on Christianophobia. The people who tend to have Christianophobia tend to be white, male, highly educated, and wealthy. And as social scientists, we know those are markers of social status. And so people who tend to be racist, at least overtly racist, white, but really the other markers, that they don't tend to be wealthy, they don't tend to be educated, and I think gender is about even. So people who are racist aren't very powerful. Now, they're probably more violent. We want to think about skinheads and things of this nature, but they're not very powerful in society. A person with Christianophobia can punish you in a much different way. And in some ways, it could be a worse way if the skinhead doesn't actually corner you in an alley or something like that, because they could affect your career. They could affect whether you get into grad school. They could affect whether you get fined if they're in government. A judge is more likely to have Christianophobia than to be a racist. And so there are different dynamics. And so the solutions are not going to be exactly the same. But the whole sort of intolerance, how we try to write off people that we don't like, I think that's quite similar. I think that's part of the human nature, part of our human depravity, if you will.
We all tend to some extent to be xenophobic in a sense, so, okay. You mentioned about the drive to promote a healthy diversity, that there was a deliberate effort to recruit in lots of places, including Christian colleges, more professors of color, and start academic programs that emphasize that. Do you see anything like that developing in academia? In other words, at some point, would you see colleges and universities saying, oh, diversity should include not only race and ethnicity, but also worldview diversity, and so rather than being bigoted against Christian professors, we might actually see a need to have, maybe one Christian professor on campus, not two, but, I mean, do you see that anywhere, or?
Well, every now and then when people are really confronted with the information, they go, oh, and then maybe we should change things. But I think for that to really happen to any significant degree, there's going to have to be a lot more cultural pressure. It's going to have to get to the point to where people feel ashamed of having Christianophobia. And I don't know if in our larger culture, especially in academic culture, if that's the case. I mean, they'll deny that they're biased, but even when it's really pointed out, I don't know if there's a true shame to it, because they'll say, well, yeah, maybe I wouldn't hire a Christian because they're less likely to be open-minded about things and stuff like that. So there's justification of it. And if you turn that on other issues, maybe I wouldn't hire an African American, but of course, they tend to be a little bit more lazier than other people. I mean, you can see how that feels. So, but that's going to take a little while for that to happen. That's why I think there has to be more research on this topic. One thing I want to do with the Christian Studies program, if I could get the funding, is to really do a really extensive study on Christianophobia, because if that research is out there, then that's more information, more evidence that this is a problem, and then people might start saying, okay, this is really a problem. Maybe I'm part of the problem. Maybe we should try to be more open to Christians who apply for our positions, stuff like that. So I think but I think it's a little ways away.
It takes time.
Yeah.
Questions from any of y'all? There's a microphone over there.
Thank you for coming out tonight. Do you think there are parallels, like you've kind of mentioned, between some of the prejudice against African Americans and some of the prejudice against Christians? Do you think possibly some of the solutions might be similar to either of those? And if so, what are they?
I would argue that where there is similarity, such as that we tend to be prejudiced against one another, so solutions would be similar. And so, one thing when I wrote the book "So Many Christians, So Few Lions," one of the solutions I suggest is let's look at our diversity training programs, and instead of training people to not be prejudiced against blacks or not be prejudiced against gays and lesbians or things like that, let's try to train people not to be prejudiced against that they're prejudiced against. And what I was arguing is that you get someone in there who has a progressive mentality and already has diversity of friends in the things that we're talking about. They're not going to be challenged by such a program. But if now we're saying, okay, but who are you prejudiced against? And that person admits, okay, I don't like conservative Christians. Okay, let's work on that. And so that's the sort of solutions I think will go across the different groups. Other things, maybe, I don't know whether there should be a affirmative action for Christians or something like that. I don't know if that really would fit given the historical differences. Awareness, I think, is a big key. But I do think that, where there are similar problems, then similar solutions would make sense.
No questions? Let me ask you a little bit more about the reception of this book. How are people taking it? Have any of your colleagues at University of North Texas read it? What kind of response are you getting?
I don't know if any of them have read it. I don't know if they read any of my stuff. That's probably a good thing.
Maybe they weigh it, which is good in terms of...
I publish academic books as well, as you well know. You have to at a research, and this is not an academic book, so I wrote it for a general audience. As far as reception of the book, I think it's gotten a good reception. I've seen plenty of people do book reviews on it. I really try a balanced approach. On the one hand, I say we Christians should not talk about being persecuted. We should put things in their proper perspective. On the other hand, this is a problem. Discrimination, harassment, that's a problem. If it doesn't rise to the level of persecution, it's still a problem. It's still something that we should be fighting against in our society. And so I think that balanced approach has been appreciated by the people who have read the book and who have written reviews. That's what I've gotten so far.
Okay. You have a paragraph in here where you say you're not really going to deal in this book with the whole question of Christians in regard to LGBT stuff and so forth, because it would just take you so far afield.
Right.
But now you have the opportunity to ask, what if you had wanted to make it twice as long a book?
Right.
What would you be saying about that?
Well, one of the reasons why I didn't want to deal with those issues is if I dealt with those issues, in fact, I originally wrote a chapter on those issues, and I and the publisher talked about it, and they were at the point, that's what everyone's going to look at. That one chapter is where everyone's going to go to, and the rest of your message will be lost. And I realized that would be the case, and so that's why I deleted that chapter. I do, and I'm actually working on some research that indicates that at least some of Christianophobia is tied. Well, let me put it this way: some of the support for LGBT issues is tied to Christianophobia. Not all, not a majority of it, but some of it is. And I do think, and I think some of the research when it comes out will tend to show this, that there's certain individuals who don't like Christians and now can use things such as LGBT issues in order to get at Christians. And I think that is an issue. And it's one, obviously, that others in academia are not going to look at, but it's one that I'm studying right now and getting at right now.
So, the personal experience is important here. Susan and I have 4 sons. Our youngest is black, and you know, that's been enormously educational to me, because I mean, I've seen the way police look at him differently than when he was 15. Police looked at him differently than they looked at white kids and so forth. I mean, I've seen some of that. Okay, you've been married now for 3 years. Okay, your wife is white. You have a 3-month-old.
Four.
Excuse me, 4-month-old. It's just getting so big.
That's a big difference to
yeah,
me.
It was huge, huge. What are you going to be teaching your son, you think, as he gets older? And what are you learning? What do you think you'll be teaching him?
As far as Christianophobia, or
as far as Christianophobia and also raceophobia, in a sense.
You know, I'll take the last one first. Probably as far as race, I probably will teach him to be a little bit more careful with police. You know, not to talk back at. I mean, I would hope I would do it anyways, but I do have a little additional fear of him talking back to a police officer. Things of this nature. I will have to deal with notions of race. Now, it's changed since I was a kid, and a lot of changes for the better. I'm not one of these people who says, hey, we're still slaves and that sort of nonsense. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to have to raise him a little bit differently because he is at least a partially black kid. Some of it will depend on how he looks like, too, because if he doesn't look that black, then he'll probably be able to get away with certain things. He has blue eyes, so maybe he'll be able to get away with certain things. As far as his faith, you know, I hope to raise him up in the faith and to encourage him. I'm going to try to prepare him as much as possible. And part of that is intellectually. I want him to not be swayed so easily by what I think are very shallow anti-Christian intellectual arguments. But also that teach him that, you know, if you live your life right, not everyone's going to like you. And in fact, if you have to have everyone to like you, then you're not going to live your life right. And so hopefully that he'll be a strong enough man that he'll be able to stand up to pressures that are going to be tossed his way. And, you know, I've always been a little bit different wherever I'm at, you know, and I hope that he's willing to be different where he's at, because I think that's going to be part of our charge as Christians in our society today.
Yeah. Question over here.
You said in regards to Black Lives Matter that the solution was somewhere in between, and that white conservatives have certain ideas, and I'm interested in what you think white conservatives are not understanding or are getting wrong or misperceiving.
Yeah, I think that white conservatives tend to perceive that race has been done in our society, that we've solved it all. You know, that, you know, today, if you're black and you're not doing well, it's your fault. And of course, that's not completely true. I mean, there's still dynamics, and I still teach from time to time on racial issues in my class and at Christian colleges, and I talk about, you know, institutional racism and how it impacts people's opportunities. And I guess, you know, a good illustration is that these barriers do not stop you, but they're going to make it less likely for you to succeed. And if you were to run a race and run a 100-yard dash and then run 100-yard hurdles, well, you're going to have a slower time. And you'll beat some people running the 100-yard dash because you're just that good, but your time would be better if you did not have the hurdles. And so understanding those dynamics, I think, are something that I think white Christians have missed when it comes to dealing with issues of race.
Well, again, I just wanted to say thank you for coming out tonight. It was truly interesting to hear your perspective on Christianophobia tonight. I wanted to ask you something. Following the gay marriage ruling, I got into a discussion with a friend of mine who said to me, well, let me explain the context. I had asked him whether or not he supported the ruling. He answered yes. Then he asked me, what's your view on separation of church and state? And I say, I believe that we do need to have God play a central role in our government, not as official, but us understanding we're accountable to him. But then he said back to me, Christianity has promoted a culture of hate, bigotry, and intolerance. How would you encourage this upcoming generation of Christians to respond to that statement? You touched on it a little bit tonight, but could you elaborate on how best we could respond to that?
Yeah, that was very common among my respondents. And separation of church and state is a very big issue that a lot of my respondents brought out. Now, what they mean by that could vary. Some of them, separation of church and state basically means Christians stay in their homes and in their churches, and that's how they say, that's how church and state is separated. The whole question of hate and bigotry is a difficult one. And here's one of the issues, since academia has not had a lot of Christian influence. When we study hate and bigotry, we study in certain ways that emphasize the things that Christians are more likely to be found to have intolerance towards. So, for example, one common theory is called right-wing authoritarianism. And so we study it, we say, well, how do you feel about feminists or atheists or homosexuals? Oh, you don't like them, you're a right-wing authoritarian. Now, I'm oversimplifying. So if someone who really knows the theories sees this, they're gonna say, well, it's not quite it. But if you really look at the methodology, that's not that far off. I've actually done some research that shows that if you replace the groups, that you can find hate and bigotry among these non-Christians as just as harsh. And so when people make that statement, I guess the counter is to say hate and bigotry is a human problem. You tend to see it among Christians, perhaps because you're not one, and perhaps you've experienced it from Christians, and I get that. But to say that it's only Christians or predominantly Christians misses the hate and bigotry that we find among other individuals. And then, if you have a couple of examples of that, that would also be a nice follow-up. I was talking with a friend of mine who happens to work. He's a person who works. He's a senator, and he says the only time he gets death threats is on LGBT issues. That's the only time that he gets death threats. So, he's a conservative, so obviously he's not going to get death threats from Christians, but still, to me, death threats is kind of hateful. And so there's some stories out there that show, anecdotal stories that show that hate and bigotry isn't just Christians. And then, I wish I could point you to more research. I have my own research, but there's not a lot of research because, once again, in academia, there's not a lot of Christians who would study these sort of things and study how people can hate Christians. That's why some of y'all may need to go into academia.
That's right. Other questions? Let me ask a question about the Christian Studies program that you would like to set up at the University of North Texas. I think there's some evidence that other minority groups that have set up specialized programs doesn't necessarily help the people who major in those programs to get jobs.
Right, yeah.
Okay, I mean, like African American Studies programs, women's studies programs, those are looked upon as how would a Christian
Well, those programs are different from mine in this way. Those programs tend to be undergraduate programs where you can get a African Studies major or minor. Right now at this point, I'm interested in a research program.
Okay.
And so, if I had someone who blessed me with the millions of dollars it would take to get to that point, eventually I probably would eventually set up some sort of Christian Studies minor, but that's not where my focus is at this point. I would like to, first, I would like to help support students who are probably Christians, although officially would not be that way, but probably Christians who are going to do a topic that's Christian Studies focused into academia. I would like to sponsor research. Some of the research I talked about Christianophobia. I would like to see some of that done. And not just Christianophobia. I mean, my previous research in race ethnicity, I studied multiracial churches and addressed the question, how can churches become more racially diverse? I mean, I have a student right now who wants to study children's ministry. I would love to get her support so she can study how can we be more effective in children's ministry. So this is not just a Christianophobia program. So my first inclination is let's get this research component together. if we get that all together, then maybe we'll start doing some coursework. Maybe we'll do an undergraduate minor. But that really is lower on my list of priorities.
Okay. Let me ask another question on the, the surveys show that African Americans are often very conservative on social issues, and particularly a lot of LGBT issues. And certainly there's awareness in the black community about how abortion has been devastating to African Americans, a lot more black babies killed percentage-wise than white babies. And yet, such a high percentage of African Americans are voting for what sadly has become the party of abortion. I don't know where you are politically, but I know you're not just kind of a knee-jerk leftist. So how do you deal with that? And how do you get more political diversity in the African American community, where logically you'd think there should be, given these positions on social issues?
I think there could be an opening in the next presidential election. To be honest, there was no opening in the past 8 years for obvious reasons.
Right.
Blacks were not going to abandon the first black president of the United States.
Right.
So that simply was not going to happen. But I do think the religious liberty issues might produce an opening. Abortion, some of the Planned Parenthood tapes could produce an opening. But the opening can't be that white Republicans go and say, hey, you're pro-life, I'm pro-life, come vote for me. If the white Republicans are not in those communities, learning, working with them on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, then approaching them when it's time to vote is not going to help them as well. But I do think there's more of an opening than people realize. I'll be interested, depending on the candidates. To be honest, the Republicans run Trump. I would not hope for very much. I don't think they're going to run him, though. But depending on who the candidates are, it'll be interesting to see the percentage of the black vote the Republican gets, because the assumption is always it's going to be under 10%, and it may well be again, depending on who the candidate is. But I think the right candidate, that could go north of 10%, and we can see where it will go.
Last question here. Do you have you're a professor at UNT,
yes,
and you actually engage with other professors, which is a very good thing to do. But do you think of that as your community? Do you have contact with scholars, African American scholars at other colleges who are interested in these same questions of Christianophobia and so forth, or are you pretty much isolated?
The African American scholars have really not shown much interest in Christianophobia at this point. And really, a lot of academics have not shown much interest in Christianophobia who are not Christians. There's a few. Jonathan Haidt, I've started some contact with him. He's not a Christian per se, but he's concerned about political diversity. He's concerned about the non-leftists in academia. Of course, some Christians are definitely fit into that. So there's not, even though some of the black scholars are Christians, that they're not as concerned. One interesting dynamic, though, I do see is that I know some scholars who are very leftist, but they're Christians. And they're enough of a Christian that they see Christianophobia. They don't write about it, but they see it, and they actually will complain to me about it. So this is not just a political dynamic. I do have some. I'm in contact with some race scholars from time to time from my previous work, but for the most part, they've not really wanted to do work in this area, in part because they want to concentrate on racial issues.
Right. So you are a pioneer, and as a pioneer, you have to go where other scholars have not yet gone, and I hope others will follow. I
hope so too. That way, they can take over and I can go do something else. So.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is Dr. Yancey's book, Hostile Environment. He has actually lugged a few copies with him, which he is prepared to sell for $10, right?
Yeah.
Or $10.05 or something. Anyway, but yes, so he does have a few. If you're interested in this, it's a good book. It really is. And please join me now in thanking Dr. Yancey for coming. We have a double header at 12:40. Carlos Campo, who is the president of Ashland University and has been very active in Hispanic education. And then at 6 o'clock, we have Michael Franzese, who is a former mafia kingpin, as we in journalism like to say. We love the word kingpin to use in relation to mafia guys, but has a remarkable career, was one of the most successful, financially successful mafia dons of 20-some years ago, and then Jesus took him, and he's changed. So it's a remarkable story, and I hope you'll be able to come at 12:40 for Carlos Campo or 6 o'clock for Michael Franzese. See you all then, I hope. Thanks for coming tonight.